Before we get to today's guest, I just want to let you all know that CityWorks Expo 2017 is coming up October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. We're really excited about the group of speakers we put together for this year, and we've got a number of exciting activities and additional resources we're looking forward to bringing to the table as well. So I hope you'll take a look at our website, cityworksexpo.com, or check us out on Facebook. And just take a look, maybe get yourself a ticket. We'd love to have you guys down to Roanoke. Or check out the fellowship program, which includes a free ticket, but also has access to a number of resources and mentorship opportunities that we're putting together. So thank you all for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoy it today. And please do give us a rating and review in iTunes or wherever you're listening to this, and reach out if you have any questions. Hope to see you come October, but in the meantime, have a great day.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Ms. Katherine Loflin, also known as the City Doctor and an acclaimed placemaking consultant. How are you doing this morning, Katherine?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing very well. And it's you're just down the road down here in Raleigh, and we were just discussing before it came on air. It's a little warm down there, is it not?
It is. It is quite warm. We our vowels are getting longer as we speak because the heat just makes us draw them on out like that. So yes, we are enjoying a North Carolina summer down here.
Well, it's I have to confess I'm not a fan of the hot weather, and so every time it gets hot, I start to think maybe I didn't want to live in this place when we decided to live.
Well, that's a normal feeling. And as I tell people, a couple of months that's not your favorite in a place is not cause for divorce necessarily from your place. Hang in there and see what happens, at least for a little while anyway.
Absolutely. Well, now, so kind of how do you define what you're doing these days, Katherine? And can you tell us a bit of background as to how you wound up in this place?
Well, sure. My background is a little bit unique. I guess a lot of your podcast guests say that, and so you're smart to collect us all together so we can sort of compare notes like this. But my background is in social work, and I have a master's and PhD in social work with a specialization in marriage and family and community practice. So you can say I did the micro and I did the macro. And along the way, to make kind of a long story short, I was recruited out of the doctoral program to move to Miami, Florida from North Carolina to be a program director at Knight Foundation. I know you've had some other folks from Knight Foundation on. And through the course of my time down there, the 10 years in Miami, I ended up reopening my consulting practice after the birth of my daughter. And my first big client was Knight Foundation because I think they were a bit surprised that I didn't come back from maternity leave, as was I. So they were like, well, can we outsource your job back to you? And I said, yes, please. And so my first job with Knight as a consultant now was the Soul of the Community Project, which was designed to be a project to help communities better understand what makes people love where they live. And why does it matter from any kind of standpoint? Does it still matter in this day of technology and sort of porous communities? Is there such a thing as place? And if there is, what makes a good place? And if you're in a good place, how do you know? And it really became a groundbreaking study because we looked at 26 cities across 3 years, spoke to 30 plus thousand people. And we found some remarkably similar findings across all 26 communities about what makes a great place. And so since we were also able to tie it to economic outcomes for communities, so for example, we found that people who were more in love or attached to their communities, those communities grew faster economically. And so we could really put some teeth in the findings. And I do believe it is that relationship to the economic part that got us in the Wall Street Journal and on USA Today and got people in the room that we probably couldn't have gotten in the room otherwise. And it really took my consultancy to a different place. I was doing a lot of different kinds of philanthropic, nonprofit evaluation, leadership development, media relations. I was doing all of this work. And then the place stuff, because of Soul of the Community, just took over. And so fast forward a few years after that, it occurred to me one time in Canada on stage as I was giving a keynote, that finding the right place to live is a lot like finding the right partner to share your life. I actually wedded my two backgrounds in marriage and family and community practice to sort of provide a framework around place science that people could relate to immediately. And one of the things we all have in common is this journey to find our match in a person. So I sort of said, well, the journey to find your right match in a place is just as important. And it's quite similar, in fact, to how we find the right place. So I spent the first part of my career focusing on, hey, how can I make places as good as they possibly can be and optimize them? And then in the latter part of my career recently, I'm now focusing on the individual side and said, okay, so now I've worked on making places great. How do you go about finding your right match in a place? And why is it so important? And what is sort of the guidelines for dating your place, for knowing when it's time to marry, for knowing when it's time to divorce? And it's really created a very relatable framework, I think, for understanding what can be very complicated place science.
Well, it's very interesting to hear that kind of progression from what can cities do to get people here, but then also to shift it around. I think that we kind of assume people will figure out where they want to be, but it's not always that easy, is it?
No, it's not. And, I think as I was working with cities all around the world, I mean, after Soul came out, Soul of the Community, it was a house of fire. It was a very huge event that took me really all around the world to talk about what makes a great place. And one of the things that happened along the way, and what started my wheels turning about this a little bit, was that I wanted to make sure that places were still being authentically who they were. I didn't want places to start pretending to be something that they're not, because I had seen places where they had done that. And then the residents who live there or who move there feel like they've gotten the worst bait and switch of their lives, because they thought they were getting one thing and they got something else. And it reminded me of when I was doing even couples counseling and how at the beginning of a relationship, people put their best foot forward all the time. And sometimes you can't maintain that. I mean, sooner or later, the mask will fall, and you will get the real deal. And so I said to places, you got to just be confident enough in who you are. To be who you are, be the best who you are, exercise, eat right, be polite, all that stuff. But, at the end of the day, you have to be you. You can't be fake. And it sort of concerned me that cities were going to sell themselves out because they didn't think they were good enough being who they were. And that is what made me sort of switch my practice with what I did with cities, but then also started focusing more on people because where you live affects every single aspect of your life. From the moment you wake up till the time you go to bed, to how much your power bill is, to whether you can bike in downtown or not. I mean, every single decision you make every single day is largely impacted by where you live. So people had to start being a little more deliberate about making those choices. I think young talent has started doing that quite nicely. It's the rest of us that we have to trickle that information down to a little bit.
But if I remember rightly, some of the Knight Foundation studies have shown that especially younger folks tend to move a place they want to live and then try and find a job there, which is very counter to long-time trends. And it's kind of interesting to see that you're kind of encouraging people to follow that kind of pursuit.
Well, it is true that we are dealing with the first generation of talent that will choose a place over a job. And the truth is that community development in this country and economic development in this country has been largely focused around the job. And when we have leadership and the economic development folks at the table who are still working kind of off this slightly outdated playbook where everything is about the job, you see communities take a hit for that because we have now these little economic engines we call young talent completely doing things differently. And so cities who have not updated their economic development playbook to include place, I think are really struggling a little bit more than they should. And so I tried to temper the message a bit to say it's not like place is the only thing that matters, but it deserves a place at the economic development table. And that's something it hasn't had before.
Hmm. It's interesting because that brings to mind here in Roanoke, where our arts and culture folks, it seems like a very odd fit for them to be underneath the economic development wing. But at the same time, that's where you develop much of that place attachment and that kind of feeling of what a community is through their arts and culture.
That's true. And I think that arts and culture really represents an important vehicle to a lot of places to help demonstrate who they think they are, and portray that in a way that feels authentic to the place. And that's why what's great about arts and culture is that it's so customizable, if you will, to the actual place and the narrative that belongs there. And so it's a really important vehicle for a community, not only to its residents, but to its tourists, to be able to really demonstrate who they are in an effective way.
I'm kind of intrigued by this concept of authenticity that you've talked about a bit. Now, it certainly resonates with me, and that's why I think my wife and I love Roanoke, and we don't see ourselves moving anytime soon. Is because as much as we love the amenities, it's really the fact that this feels like a real place that we can plug into.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering that cities change over time, and so how do you make sure that you can remain authentic over that time, and that change happens at an appropriate pace, or how do you kind of accommodate that when investment comes in?
Well, and that's the $1 million question. I think a lot of cities are really trying to find that balance. And in my opinion, it starts first of all with seeing that your identity and your narrative as a place is important. A lot of cities, when I talk about, who are you as a place, I get a lot of blank stares. And so the first step is to really spend some time defining your narrative, defining your identity. And I spend a lot of time now with cities helping them do that. And I really feel like my, I always say my shrink background helps with that, because I can massage more than maybe a planner or an engineer or an architect could maybe do that. We can really get to the stuff, the easy stuff and the hard stuff about what it's like living there. So I do think the really first important step is to know who you are as a place. The second step is to find it valuable. Is to say, this is the essence of who we are that we want to hold on to. This is what has made us who we are. And of course, your narrative comes from many, many different sources, everything from your people to your history, and your culture and your landmarks and where you're positioned geographically. I mean, all of these things come into play. So you have to embrace it and say, we know what it is, we've embraced it. And then as growth and opportunities come in the community, I mean, I'm a big believer that knowing your narrative is not an excuse not to progress. You still have to find that way to continue to move forward and grow in a smart way. But what's important about that is holding who you are as a place sacred while you do that, so that there's not a compromise of a 20-story shiny building in your downtown landscape that would not fit the way it should be there, or who you are, or getting rid perhaps of a lot of structures that are representative of who you are, or at least salvaging parts of those structures that matter so you can make sure and hold on to your narrative as you go. So it's not an either or conversation. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, it's become an either or conversation. Either we grow and we progress, or we keep being what we've always been. You hear these conversations all the time. And as a psychologist, as somebody who understands human behavior, I can tell you that what's behind that is fear. It's a fear of a loss of place. So if someone can come in and sort of say, what is it that you're afraid of losing? What is that essence of your place? And how can we make a covenant to really hold on to that as we find ways to still move? Everybody unclenches a little bit, and it becomes, but of course, leadership has to keep their promise. And that's the other side of this game, is that, once you make that covenant with your people that you love this place for the essence of who it is as well, you got to hold on to that. And you have to make sure that you're making choices that reflect that. So it's complicated, but it's doable. And I think that cities are really at a point in their own history right now where they're having to bridge this gap, get through this crossroads. And so, really understanding place from a psychological perspective can really help you with that.
I'm intrigued because it kind of sounds like, from my perspective and kind of the background that I come from, that this is really what we're trying to create is a shared vision in some ways, that this is who we are and this is where we want to go. And so that once you've created that, you can move forward. But if you don't have that, any kind of step is going to be very tenuous.
That's right. I mean, or it's going to be not very strategic. I mean, I am still, I'm a researcher. I believe in empiricism and I believe in strategy. And I think that when we don't have a framework that's informing our choices, we could be bouncing off the walls for years. And you see a lot of cities who are doing that. We have that what we call shiny penny syndrome, where leadership gets very distracted by, wow, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And people have learned over time, oh, that's just how they are. Just give them 2 years to twirl about this and we can go back to normal life, And so it is very important to have people on the very same page. That brings up an example for me. I'm involved in community theater down here, and we just closed a show that was written by a local resident playwright that really covers the history of one of our towns here from Civil War to modern day. And it was called Finding Patience, the story of Holly Springs. And it was probably by far the best example I've really ever seen about place-based theater, which is really how you can use the arts and use local theater to tell the story of your place. And it instills, you wouldn't believe, I mean, our shows, all 11 of them, were sold out. People were clamoring for tickets. We had scalpers the closing night of the show. It was crazy. But what was even more powerful for me was seeing the reaction of people after the show, and the pride and the tears and the happiness and all those things in between, which seems to translate from people who just moved here last month to people who had lived here their whole lives. So really that importance of sharing your vision, sharing your history, so that a new generation can be on board. And importantly, from a place match perspective, so a resident could say, oh, okay, I get you. It's not for me, but I get you. You know what I mean? So it goes both ways. It's not like you're going to want to attach people to your place at any single cost. You want to attach people to your place because there is an authentic connection or attraction between the two of you that make it work. So being able to be on the same page allows people who are considering your place to figure out, could I ride this train with these folks or not? And that's a really important step to community health.
I'm kind of intrigued to see if you think this goes a step further, this kind of metaphor of dating or being in a relationship with your city, that I think we all know that it takes a lot of work in a relationship to make it happen and make it last. I presume you would kind of agree that that's true for communities as well, that if you come in and expect to just have the community give to you,
that's right.
That's not going to be in a very effective relationship. That's
right. And so one of the things that is amazing about us humans is that if you think about it, our whole lives are really a search for feeling like we belong, that we fit. When we're young, we want our folks, to love us and feel like we're a part of our family unit, that we belong there. When we get a little older, we care about our peers. We want to feel like our peers accept us and we belong in that group. And then as we get older, we look for belonging in our careers and in our jobs and then in our neighborhoods and then with our spouses. And even as we age, I mean, even in retirement, then we try to still reconnect where we cannot feel isolated, where we can feel like we belong. So in fact, our entire lives are about a search for belonging. And place plays a huge role throughout our whole life history to really find that sense of belonging. And so it is it's some of the most important work we as humans can do is to find that environment where we thrive. And when we find that environment that brings out the best in us, the science is really clear that we become optimized humans. When we find that sense of belonging, a lot of things happen in our brain chemistry that make us be even better than who we are in environments where we know we're not thriving. And so, yes, we see people when they are in love with their place, when they're committed to their place, they give more back to that ecostructure that provides that experience. And it's the same for whether you're talking about any environment, your work environment, your school environment, your marital environment. You want to feel like you fit. And when you feel like you fit, it's not even hard to give back to that person because you want to sustain that ecosystem. You want it to work. And so what's amazing about people who are fully attached to their communities, they report being more satisfied in their jobs. They report being more productive in their jobs. They're much more entrepreneurial in that place than they would be otherwise. They're more engaged from a social perspective. They're involved in more things. And most importantly, they are much more on the hook. They see their future as the place's future. They see their futures allied and tied. So they won't let things get but so bad, because then they will lose the environment that they need. And so it is a very scientific process that we have with our places that's built really on our evolution as humans and what we need to survive. And so in that sense, we do have to work on that relationship. We do have to make it work. But by the same token, just like any other good relationship, it shouldn't be arduous work. You know what I mean? It should feel natural. And so you shouldn't have the guilt motivation that brings you out in a place. Just like you don't want to feel like, oh, I have to do this with this person. And gosh, I really don't want to, but I better because then I'll hear about it. You don't want that life. You want it to feel natural and giving. And so it is a lot of work, but it should also feel like you're sustaining your own proactive, positive environment that you need to continue to feed your own soul as well.
It's almost like it's not a hard choice at that time. It's just it's what comes natural because you want to give back in some ways.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I'm not so head in the clouds that I don't get that. Just like with some marriages, I mean, sometimes people. Time has passed and you're different and I'm different, or we don't have things in common. We've both kind of changed. It's nobody's fault. Some people have the courage and the ability to say, let's end this. let's not do this anymore. Not because I'm bad or you're bad, but because it's just different now. And the same is true, I think, for people with their place. But there is a real truth to people who get stuck in their place because they don't have either the economic means, or especially our older residents who feel like change is scary. So the same reasons that sometimes bad marriages stay together are the same reasons why people stay stuck in a place that they can't escape because they can't afford it, or they're scared, or they don't know what's on the other side of that door. So the devil you know is better than the devil that you don't. And I've worked in a lot of places where there's a high proportion of people who are truly stuck in that place. And it is probably the hardest cases to deal with because you're stuck in a situation saying, well, how can I make the best of this, even though it's not for me? And so it really is about knowing yourself and knowing your place and hopefully being able to navigate that as things move forward. Sometimes it's forever and sometimes it's not. And we have to get kind of comfortable for that for the greater good. Because large proportions of stuck in place communities, you feel it when you walk in. At least I do. And it's a hard thing to navigate, both for the people and for people like me whose job it is to really help people optimize themselves with their place.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Well, it's interesting because I think your background in social work, I think, gives you an interesting perspective, and to know that like there's that deeply social work is, perhaps among the most unsexy work in the world, but the most important work in the world at the same time.
Right.
And placemaking work, can be very exciting, very, very energizing, and yet at the same time, if it's not touching some of those same bases that the social work is touching, it can be empty in some ways.
Well, and that's very well said. I think that's very well said, because I had to, I don't fit in the placemaking world. I don't fit in the planning world. I don't fit in the architecture world. I mean, there's but yet I managed to navigate all those systems effectively, because I think what I bring to the table is this insight into the human side of place, and let people feel emotion about these issues, and get it out of being so clinical all the time, as far as, this has to be zoned this way. Well, what's going on there? Here comes the shrink to say, well, what is that's happening there? And I think it helps break through some walls when people can be a little more vulnerable about what's going on, and actually say, it's because I love this place so much that I'm so scared right now. Or it's because I love this place so much that I'm so proud of it right now. And change that conversation. But social work, in how we're taught as social workers, and what attracted me to the field, because I was going to go pure psychology, maybe even psychiatry. And what I appreciated about the social work perspective is that its main idea, when you boil it down to everything else, is person and environment fit. How well does a person fit in their environment? And when they don't, what does it do to them as people, and how can you help them change that? So whether that's a family dynamic or a community dynamic or a neighborhood dynamic, it's the same. So it really holds dear this idea that it's not just a person and when they were potty trained, or whether their mother loved them or whatever. And it's not just the place's fault. It's not just the environment's fault. It's like, what happens when we as people step into a social landscape? And how do we thrive or not? And how can we make the environment better so people can thrive? And how can people contribute to the environment in such a way that makes that relationship work? And so, yes, you see us focusing sometimes, at least traditional social work, on child welfare and homelessness and the social issues of our time that really matter. But what's at the heart of those social issues is, I guarantee you, somewhere along the line of that individual, they fell out of belonging with their environment. And once that happens, you can start tracking whatever social outcome, bad outcome that they're going to have, whether it's delinquency, child abuse, domestic violence, substance abuse. I promise you, you can trace them all back to, at one point or another, they fell out of connection with their environment. And isolation is what gets us in trouble as people.
Well, it's really fascinating, because I think that so some of my background is in my most recent job before doing this was working at a community health center, which is, I think, vitally important work, and I would argue placemaking work as well. And even several years ago, I was volunteering for Meals on Wheels every week, and that is perhaps
you go.
You're right in there, and I think it's also vitally important to recognize that these places are perhaps much bigger than many of us think. That when we're talking about Roanoke, it's not. We can talk about specific communities within that, but we're all part of a collective and we all impact one another in that space.
That's right. And you've got it absolutely right. So some of the things that, you had focused on, I mean, one of the things we found, what's great about Soul of the Community is it's the gift that keeps on giving. We have this huge data set. And even though the data is old, our last collection was in 2010, I have students all over the world right now still mining that data, using it for their dissertations. And they contact me with questions or findings, or I get these wonderful celebratory posts on Facebook. I got my dissertation. It was passed, and it was Soul of the Community. But what's also great for me is that they tell me what they found. And the thing about community attachment is that we are still just now really understanding the power of this concept. I've worked really hard with mayors all over the world to get them to include some kind of metric about resident attachment to place as one of their key index indicators that they look at every few years, as much as school dropout or unemployment, because it does tell you something important about your place. But one of the things that we found, my students have found, is that people who are highly attached to their place also are more likely to seek public health when they need it. Public health seeking behaviors increase. So especially with older people, they will, get medical checkups. They will walk more. They will be less likely to have deleterious outcomes from a health perspective because they feel connected to that environment. They want to be in it. And when something goes wrong, they don't feel as much shame to go out and say, I have a problem here, doc, And so it's a powerful thing that, like I said, really does seem to make us better people when we find that connection, even from a community health idea. So, and that's what my students taught me. I'm learning as we go. And the more I learn about community attachment, the more I feel like it is the frontier of the future for places to really understand their vitality and where they need to focus on as far as being sustainable, but also being a quality of life place.
That's so interesting. What comes to mind when you're saying that is this idea of, in the placemaking world, we talk a lot about activating spaces.
Right.
But in this, it seems like really you can have incredible impacts if you can activate the people in a place.
That's right. And I think that, one of the things because I'm usually included in that placemaking world. And what I always bring to this table of placemaking is that we have to look beyond public spaces. We have to look beyond activation areas in the community and destinations and all of that stuff. We have to focus also on the people and how they are. Where are they feeling attached or are they not? What is the emotion going on behind there? And then how does that filter down even to their backyards? I did a blog for realtor.com, which is interesting because real estate communities are now much more engaged in this conversation than they've ever been because they're dealing with clients that expect them to sell places as well as they sell houses. And a lot of realtors aren't quite built for that yet. So I'm working to help that. But I did this blog for realtor.com, and I talked about how you home yourself in a neighborhood and how you find that right place. And I talked about everything from even front porches, how we design our houses these days. That new urbanist idea of, do we set ourselves up for interaction or do we set ourselves up for isolation? Even in how we design our personal property. And here in the South, front porches are where we show that we're open for social interaction, even if we don't know you. And our back porches is where we go have a drink after dinner with our closest of friends, So it boils down to even the most personal of spaces. It reflects your greater attachment to the community itself as a person. So we have to look beyond these activation public spaces to even the most micro spaces, and because it all adds up to creating that place.
Well, I'm intrigued. I know that some of your work in the past has kind of dealt with the importance of social capital, but that's really, in some ways, what we're talking about here is this idea of needing to create connections and needing to create relationships, and that's the foundation that a lot of this builds on.
Yeah, I think, I wrote my dissertation on social capital and how do social networks either encourage or discourage us in various things. And my outcome variable was political and civic engagement. I mean, do your networks somehow relate to how much you give back to your community or how active you are in a traditional voting, volunteering sense? But the thing about social capital and why it's different, I think, than this idea of community attachment is social capital is a little, and I noticed this in the data, in the Soul data, because we did study social capital. Social capital is a value that we sort of are brought up with. Like we either feel like we should be connected. It was a value that our parents taught us about voting and being engaged and involved. And it's more about who you are than where you live. So you come to a place with some hard wiring about those ideas. And then you will either enter a place that either encourages that, which brings it out 110%, so you're running on all rails, or it will kind of make you minimize that a little bit. And so it's really an interesting concept about social capital sort of gets built into us by the time we're in middle school. Voting, volunteering, and our ability to engage from a social capital perspective kind of gets locked in by the time we're in middle school. And yet community attachment and our ability to feel connected to a place is much more nimble. You can fix that a little bit later in the game. Then you can't. Social capital is a hard thing to get to change. It takes a long time. But what we found, one of the things we found in Soul that was so amazing is that you can change personal connection to place within 1 year if you have the right things coming to the table in a place. So people who felt differently about the social offerings of their community had same year differences in attachment. So if the social offering perception changed, you'd see the attachment move right with it. Social capital does not move that quickly. It takes a lot more time because it's hardwired. The deal is done much earlier on. So that's why mayors and I think CEOs and a lot of the clients I have love this idea of attachment because there's still hope. There's still a chance that we could make that come around. And so mayors and those leaders, community leaders, like quick turnarounds, like things that they can see the needle move on. And civic engagement and social capital is a harder nut to crack. That's why we as parents have to focus on that with our children so that when they get to the right place, they can really thrive on that.
That's really interesting. And I would imagine that the idea of once someone is attached to their place and building in that world, that's where those first steps towards that long journey to build social capital come from.
You got it. That's exactly right. So it does exactly do that. It feeds on each other. And that's why you hear young people who, even today, and in my generation, I'm 45, and I still know that when I lived in Miami, Florida, it was not the place for me. I knew it. And part of it was from growing up in North Carolina and having such a different sort of experience there. Not that anything was wrong with Miami, but I was raised on sort of these small town values that you spoke to people in the grocery store when you don't know them. You cannot do that really in Miami, Florida, because people are immediately suspicious about, well, what do you want? What are you after? And so it was a hard learning curve for me down there. And I had to change a little bit about who I was to live there. And I resented that, to be honest with you. So it does, how we are raised does build in us what we look for in many ways to our place. And young people today say the same. I went out and I lived in New York, but now I want to come back to, when I get serious about life, I'm going to have to probably choose somewhere close to where I grew up or somewhere similar to that kind of feeling that was instilled in me as I was growing up, if they were in love with that place because of their parents. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of intrigued with this discussion because my own graduate work was on individual versus collective responsibility with regard to the environment. And so I'm intrigued kind of how, when you go into a community, there are certain communities that have a lot of people that think community wide. They think about what matters for the community. And there are others where I think it's a lot more focused on either for various reasons, rightly or wrongly. A lot of people have been hurt by communities. A lot of people have been hurt by their families that are part of communities. And so how do you get work in a community where there's less interest in being engaged in that place? That doesn't have so many people that think collectively about things?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that for me, one of the things I tell the leaders I work with at every level is that you really have to start where the people are, and you have to train your argument to make sense to them where they are. So you can't guilt people into this idea. It doesn't work. Guilt to get behaviors out of people that you want is not sustainable, and it's a very risky endeavor. So I often find in places like that where there's not a collective sense, is that you have to work more on the individual level and figure out, okay, what's important to you? What is the thing? I'm not going to guilt you into believing that you should care more about the collective. I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do is figure out what it is that's making you tick in this particular environment. And when I figure out what are the things that matter to you, and you'll hear a lot of, well, I care, a lot of fear-based responses. You hear, well, I care about the safety of my family. I care about my house value. I care about not getting underwater in a mortgage. I care about having a job. I care about these things. And so you have to sort of retrain your argument away from a collective to, okay, now this is how the things we're talking about connect to your individual needs. And if they want to be selfish, unfortunately or fortunately, you have to help them be selfish, because once they are able to get those needs met, again, what kicks in is they think, hey, my place is providing me to feel less fearful about certain things. My place is doing something, and I want to be a part of that. And so you sort of have to go back door. You sort of have to come in the back door to get them to be more collective by saying, let us appeal to your appeal to your selfishness and get those needs met. And then you'd be surprised how quicker they are to join the collective, because they feel like they're truly among like-minded people who care. But anyway, that's my idea with the collective versus the individual, is you really have to work where they are and then bring it back to maybe a more collective place a little bit down the road.
Well, I'm intrigued kind of, you've mentioned working with mayors and other folks. I wonder what you think the appropriate role of government is in some of these conversations, and when that's an appropriate tool and when it's not such an appropriate tool.
You know what? You ask probably some of the best questions I have been asked on a podcast in a very long time. I'm sitting here, rubbing my face because I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this guy knows what to ask. Government and public leadership is a very interesting dynamic. And like about me now, I was, I bathed at the baptismal of civic engagement and social capital, and then Soul of the Community came out, and I have to tell you that the only thing that people rated worse about their local economies at the time that we did the project, which was 2008 and 2010, where the bottom was really falling out of our economies locally. The only thing people rate lower than their local economy at that time was local leadership. We had to redraw the data grid to get the data point on it. It was so low. And luckily or unluckily, people don't feel like their leadership matters to whether or not they love their place or not. I've had many people tell me, I love this place despite my leadership. And so then I got to go to all these lovely town hall meetings where people would stand up in front of the mayor and say some version of, the best thing he can do or she can do is get out of our way, because we actually got this. We don't really, need that. And so in my book, I talk about mayors and community leadership as the mother-in-law in your relationship. Yeah, hang with me. It gets real interesting. So how we know what a good mother-in-law is, we know what a bad mother-in-law is. The bad one doesn't really gives advice, but doesn't really look for collaboration. It's kind of always in the way, know it all. not very interested in anything but hearing their own selves speak, mostly to you about what you need to do differently. Good mother-in-laws say, I'm here to facilitate this relationship. How can I make you two get along as best as I can? Do you need a date night? Let me figure out, can I babysit the kids? Can I provide the vehicle by which you get that date night? I'm here when you need me, and sometimes I will lead and sometimes I will follow. And I'm okay with either. I listen and I also talk. It's more of a balanced thing, but what's at the heart of it isn't their own ego or their own agenda, but the health of the union. And I think if mayors and leaders focus a little bit more using that perspective, what is best for this union of this place with these people, you start thinking differently about your own strategy as a leader and how you talk about your strategy as a leader. And then, of course, I worked for many, many years in the private sector of philanthropy, and I learned pretty quickly that the private sector is powerful, and individual private donors and CEOs and those that work in the private sector, sometimes that's where the innovation starts. And then because our government, our local leaders don't feel comfortable taking risks. Philanthropy, local people, they'll take a risk. They'll try something new because they don't need to worry about using taxpayer dollars to do it. So they'll try something new. And then you'll see local elected leaders say, I knew it all along. I knew this would work. And when it doesn't go well, they're like, see, aren't you glad I didn't use our money for that? So, I think our leadership, with a little tweaking in how they envision their role, could really open up new doors for them. But also, we can't just look to them. We have to look to ourselves, and we have to look to the private sector to also be a powerful force of social innovation and change when needed, or sustaining what's great about a place as we move forward. So the leadership equation is one that I spend a lot of time on, because I think there's some real clear things that leaders could do that would not only make their jobs better, but would also help them be more successful in their endeavors.
Well, now,
so as mother-in-law, don't forget it. So the next time you see your leader giving the state of the city talk, say, well, am I listening to you and your lovely agendas and your lovely board meetings that you attend? Or do I hear things in your message that make me feel good about the union, state of the union? I mean, come on, it's written right into what we call these things. How is this union between me and this environment going?
But I just love that. It's I wasn't sure, and now I love the analogy.
That's how I work. See, people say, "Huh?" when they meet, but by the time I'm done with them, they're like, "Oh yeah, I get it."
Well, I wonder, you've been to all kinds of different places and worked in all kinds of different contexts, and I wonder, what do you look for when you go into a new place, or when you're looking at a place and you've just climbed off the airplane? What do you see first?
Yeah. So, the first sentence of my book says, I'm often asked what my favorite place is. And it's a valid question given what I do. And then I end up saying in that paragraph, my favorite place is the loved place. And I can see a loved place from go. And part of it is my training, I'm sure, but part of it is my gut and my instinct when I walk into a place. Even if the place isn't for me, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't need to work for me. It needs to work for you. And if it's working for you, then your expertise about that place matters way more than mine. So I might know what I know, but you know that it's working for you. And so walking into a place that I know is a loved place, even if I would never live there in a million years, I get such joy out of seeing places that are loved, even on the smallest of economic scales. I spent about a week or 10 days or so in the Yukon in Canada, and I worked in towns that were literally 20 people. That was the entire town. And they would talk. They were like, "How do we create more spaces?" I said, "Whose backyard is the biggest? Let's just go with that." I think that's what I would do, but they wanted to, we want to connect more and we love it here. And we don't really care if more people come or not. We just want to do right by it, and we want to do right by
Hmm.
ourselves. That's powerful, because those people are okay with who they are and where they are. And that reflects in everything they do in that place. And so I love the loved place more than anything. I think it tells me that they are in good shape. And sort of like the stuck in place where there's not as much love there, you can feel it. Everything is harder. Everything is sadder in some ways. And it doesn't have anything to do with economics. I've seen very disadvantaged communities where their attachment is so high that you just believe in miracles, and you see miracles on the ground in those places. And I've
Hmm.
seen very wealthy places where there's not really a lot of attachment, and it is almost oppressive. So really finding that way to get to loved places is what matters. I One final story I'll tell you. One of my communities was and still is Fort Wayne, Indiana. And people are like, Fort Wayne, Indiana, what are you talking about? But Fort Wayne is a really interesting little place. And when you said as soon as you get off the plane, which made me think of Fort Wayne, so
Hmm.
let me explain why. When I get off a plane, depending on how long the flight was, I'm sort of already in, okay, I gotta find the car and I gotta get there, and then tomorrow I have to be there by 7. I'm in a mode of,
Hmm.
sometimes the flight's not great, and these days, my goodness, you never know what you're gonna get on a flight. And so I come out off a plane in a place, head down, elbows out. I mean, that's it. That's how I am. But and a lot of us are that way. But in Fort Wayne, when you get off the plane, there is a retiree of that community who stands at every single gate for every single disembarking flight, who's sitting there with her own homemade baked cookies. And
Hmm.
she hands one to every single passenger and she says, "Welcome to Fort Wayne. I hope you enjoy your stay. If there's anything you need, or I can answer for you."
Hmm.
And this is what I'm telling you. They don't let that culture go. Like, they try to reset you the moment you get off the plane, to say, "You know what? Here we are. We're actual people. This is going to be great. Here's a cookie. Grandma's handing you a cookie. Go behave." I mean, that's basically, and that we love that you're here. And so every time I get off a plane in Fort Wayne, as I'm walking up the bridge, I have to say, "Okay, Catherine, be ready to be receptive and have a pleasant look on your face, because I know there's going to be this older lady with a cookie at the end of this gate." And it sets the tone for my experience in that place. So, how do you set the tone as soon as people get off the plane? Or what does your city look like when they enter by car? I mean, it sets the tone, because the aesthetics of a place and the way it looks and feels is the first and most consistent message a place sends about itself. So what message are you sending when people come off a plane, or when people drive into your city? Because it does set the tone for the experience.
This is so we were watching a video for a small town in West Virginia yesterday that somebody shared with us, where it's just a bunch of folks dancing around to a song, having a good time in their community for their tourism board. And it was just, in some ways, it was very appealing, because really what you want to see is people that enjoy their lives in the place where they are.
Yeah.
Um, and even though I've never been there, I now kind of want to go there.
Well, and they have lots of, they've had, and it hasn't always been easy, as you can imagine. It's not always easy for any place, but and the big picture is, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be a 40 million performing arts center, $40 million performing art. It doesn't have to be rocket science, but it has to be effective, and you have to flip certain levers with people. I mean, and that's it. And part of it is, do people
seem to love their place. And when you see them love their place, even if you don't particularly love it, you love the experience of being around that dynamic. And so it doesn't have to be expensive to be powerful. And I think at the end of the day, that's the best placemaking we can do, is the kind that makes a difference without breaking the bank and allows people to just be more in love with where they are.
Well, that's a compelling vision to set forth, and we're kind of coming to a close here, and so you've kind of already shared the story that I usually end with, but I wonder if you could share kind of something that you've learned that was unexpected along the way, that may be something that you didn't expect you'd be thinking at this point in time.
Well, all right, I will go there with you. So the other side of this equation for me is that I discovered that our relationship with place is a lot like our relationship with our partner when I personally was going through a divorce. And so I was spending my days basically being a cheerleader for place with the Soul of the Community findings and making those things work and being rah-rah for place, and then and coming home in the evenings and just being, oh my God, my life happened here, and how am I going to recover this, and what's next for me, and all of that. And so my whole perspective on place, and it coming to a place that I feel like is right, actually was born out of a lot of personal sadness for me, and a lot of and at the same time I was leaving Miami. So I was leaving Miami. I was divorcing Miami. And the same time I was going through a personal divorce, and those things were completely interconnected for me. And so I never imagined that this whole new world that I feel like has made place science relatable to the masses could have ever come out of a time of such personal hardship for me. But I got to the point that I had to say, divorce isn't always bad. I mean, there's some really, sometimes it's what's needed. And we as people go through changes, and it doesn't always work out. And so what does that mean? Isn't that true for places? Because I was feeling guilty about everything, about leaving Miami, about everything. And so I never believed that, the thing that would probably put me on TED stages and allowed me to win awards internationally was coming from such a place of personal hardship that led to such a transformative discovery.
Well, what a powerful story to end on, and it's just proof in some ways that everything is personal in some ways.
That's right.
Well, Katherine, I really appreciate you taking the time today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've probably taken too much of your time already. But for those of you all listening that are interested, you can learn more about Katherine at LoflinConsultingSolutions.com. Any other place they can go to find more about you?
Sure. Yes. Let's see. And I will. You can go to www.city-doctor.com. I'm also on Facebook at The City Doctor. And I am going to put a promotion on my website this afternoon that with the promo code Roanoke, you can get 20% off my book if you buy it through city-doctor.com today for the next 30 days, let's say.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Katherine. Sure. And for those of you all interested in CityWorks, you can find us at CityWorks Expo. That's xpo.com. And again, thank you, Katherine, and I hope you have a great day.
Hey, thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.